Well, ladies and gentlemen, good morning and welcome to this, the second of the breakfast conversations with the Archbishop for 2015. As we gather this morning, let me begin by acknowledging the original custodians of this land on which we meet, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, and we honour their elders past and present. My name is Chris Lancaster. I'm the vicar of the Anglican parish of Altona and Laverton, and I'm your MC for this morning. And our topic for this morning's conversation is This Can't Continue, Ending Domestic Violence. This is a conversation that has been underway for some time in the Anglican Diocese of Melbourne, particularly in the last 3 years since the appointment of Dr. Ray Bode as Project Officer for the Prevention of Violence Against Women program, and with significant input also from the Reverend Scott Holmes, among others. And at last year's synod, it was noted that this program is providing a model and an incentive to other faith communities. And so joining us this morning to continue this conversation and to bring their significant expertise and experience, we welcome Joanna Fletcher and Paul Linossier. And let me tell you a little bit more about them in introducing them. Joanna Fletcher is the Chief Executive Officer of the Women's Legal Service Victoria, a statewide specialist community legal centre which has been providing free legal services to women in Victoria for over 30 years. Joanna has been working on issues arising from relationship breakdown and violence against women for over 14 years. Prior to commencing as CEO of Women's Legal Service Victoria in April 2010, she managed their policy and advocacy work. She was also the National Law Reform Coordinator and National Spokesperson for Women's Legal Services Australia. Joanna is a member of the Ministerial Advisory Roundtable for the Prevention of Family Violence and has been a significant contributor to family violence and family law policy reform. Joanna has also worked as a senior researcher in family violence at the Judicial College of Victoria and as a senior advisor in the Family Violence Reform Coordination Unit in state government. Paul Linossier is the inaugural CEO of Our Watch, formerly the Foundation to Prevent Violence Against Women and Their Children, commencing in January last year. Paul trained in social work at Monash University, and his subsequent senior appointments have included Director of Harrison Youth Services, Executive Director of Kildonan Child and Family Services, and founding CEO of MacKillop Family Services. He's also had a consultancy practice specialising in strategic planning and organisational review. From June 2012, he co-led the whole-of-government Vulnerable Children Strategy Team and then assisted in the establishment of the Foundation to Prevent Violence Against Women and Their Children through 2013. Paul's a life member of the Centre for Excellence in Child and Family Welfare and a past chairperson of the Council of Catholic Social Services in Victoria. He's been a member of the Premier's Victorian Children's Council and a board member of both Melbourne City Mission and the Victorian Council of Social Service. He was awarded a Centenary Medal for services to the welfare sector and in September 2007, the Robin Clark Memorial Award for Inspirational Leadership. So would you please welcome Joanna Fletcher and Paul Linossier. So Archbishop Philip, over to you.
Thank you, Chris. And thank you, everyone. A recent article I read said this, that in Victoria alone, police were called out to 65,393 domestic violence incidents in 2013-2014 year, twice as many as in 2009 and 10. And of those, almost 30,000 were serious enough for police to press charges. And we're told a little later that that's likely to be vastly underreported. What's your reactions, Joanna, to that kind of scale? Because you're on the coalface dealing with this reality.
Certainly. One aspect of it we are absolutely confident of is that there has been a significant increase purely in reporting by women to police. And that's a really encouraging sign because it means that women are more confident in the police response. Services are also reporting that they think there is an actual increase in the issue. We're yet to measure that again by another personal safety survey. They occur about every 6 years, but that's certainly the view that services have.
And Paul, what's your take on the scale that is being reported? How much underreported do you imagine this could be?
Well, I think it's variously referred to as a national emergency or a national epidemic, and the extent of men's violence against women across the country is profound. We know that 1 in 3 women experience physical violence. 1 in 3 women over the age of 15 years experience physical violence in their lifetime. 1 in 5 will experience sexual violence. We know that 1 in 6 women will experience violence from a current or former partner, and that the formal statistics will tell us that on average 1 woman is killed in Australia each week by a current or former partner. And if we look at, there's a website that you can go to, Destroy the Joint. It will show that there's been 31 murders of women this year in Australia in the first 15 weeks of the year. And so that will sit down. Many of those cases are yet to go before the court or appeal to be heard and the like. But there is clear evidence of a pervasive problem, a long-standing problem that's been one reserved to the private realm, not one for public discussion or significant public policy debate. But we're seeing this year and over the last 3 years, I think, a significant movement in that regard.
Yeah, I'm interested to perhaps hold together those two sort of things. I suppose, when we use words like epidemic, it sounds like it's something that's, a new onset of something, but then, there's also this pervasiveness and something that's well established. How do you, in the absence, I suppose, of the same measurement and figures, you can only go on police reporting and those things, but what's your sense of, are we just more becoming aware of a pervasive reality that's always been present in our society and culture, or are we actually seeing violence against women actually rising and more incidents of it actually happening?
My view is that reporting is increasing massively, and that actual incidents of violence is on the increase, but not in the proportions that the reporting would tend to indicate. One of the encouraging things is police, when they first researched and wrote their code of practice in 2004, they estimated, and ABS stats bear this out, that only about 20% of violence against women is ever reported to police. Police believe that number is more like 40 to 50%. It's still not great, but it's obviously a significant jump.
And this article that I was referring to said that, went on to say that when women do leave their partners, they're jumping into a safety net that's full of holes. That didn't sound very optimistic, because I'm aware that the times of greatest risk are when people are taking some steps to leave an abusive situation.
That's exactly right. And we have a service system that, as the article indicated, does have significant service gaps. Women who need to be in high security refuge are very often placed in motels because there are simply not enough beds in high security supported refuges for them to go to. And probably worse is what happens next, which is a broader question around homelessness and housing in this state and this country. And that is that there's nowhere for them to move on to after refuge. And if we want an explanation for one of the really key statistics that we talk about, which is that women leave 8 times before they finally leave, that's a very good indication of why that might be, even in very serious cases of violence.
So just talk us through some of those holes a bit more, so we can sort of, I think, understand what are the other things apart from, say, the inadequacy of crisis accommodation or alternative accommodation arrangements.
Certainly in sort of my core area, I guess, the justice system, the availability of legal assistance to address matters, not just the violence itself through the intervention order process, but as importantly, the steps that are needed to actually recover from the violence in terms of making sure that there are safer living arrangements for the children, making sure that the victim of violence receives an appropriate share of the property pool so she can care for herself and the children. It's very, very difficult to get legal assistance, particularly in family law these days. You can get some in the intervention order space, and there is a network of what we call duty lawyer services, which is where we just assist clients on the day at court. They're not universally available across the state, and they're probably an extreme example, and there is actually a duty lawyer service here, but at the Kyneton court, it's so small that the lawyer from the legal centre there has to interview clients in her car.
That'd be a very inadequate situation, in anyone's understanding.
Yeah, far from ideal. Yeah.
And Paul, what's your take on the holes in the system that we should know about?
Well, as we were established as an organisation and announced in the middle of 2013, we engaged in a national consultation across the country, every capital city, and Kalgoorlie and Cairns, Alice Springs. And we met with people on the ground working directly with women who were escaping the circumstance that we're talking about, and to seek their advice about how we might position our work. The purposes of our watch is to engage in a national conversation that changes the community norms and the underlying values and attitudes that sit behind men's violence against women. And the message from service providers was one of distress initially, that they were having to take quite difficult decisions in which women and which circumstances they responded to, what level of support and intervention they could provide. And as they came to understand our work and the logic of primary prevention, they realised that a stronger, more coherent and pervasive public conversation would enable more women to take action, and that the demands on their services would grow considerably. And I think that's proven to be the case over the last 2 years. The service system across the country is greatly stressed and facing rising demand. But those same workers, a manager or supervisor of a women's refuge, a social worker co-located with police, people, counsellors working in men's behaviour change programs, encouraged us to stay with the work because they saw no end in sight unless there was profound change within our society, within our community, to those deeply held values, distorted values, and that change had to happen at that level. Work had to move upstream to complement the work that they were doing on the ground. And so we've maintained two, I think, really key points from those conversations. The first is that we acknowledge the sorts of changes that are mooted and being pushed for today come off the back of sustained work from the women's movement over more than 40 years. And we have to respect how hard people have worked to try and get the conversation into the public realm. And the second thing is that there is no magic solution or response to the issue. We need a sustained and growing investment by all governments and real and meaningful engagement by civil society in direct response services, in early intervention and in prevention services, if we are over a generation to fundamentally change men's violence against women.
And if I could just pick up on one point there, I think one thing that we're yet to see is a real recognition that when we do start taking action early to try to stop violence from occurring in the first place, what we will see in response to that initially is an increase in demand from women, because the messages are, they're more sophisticated than this, of course, but the messages are, violence, shouldn't be happening, and there are services to, that you are going to be protected if you take action. You'll see a peak. It will take a while before those messages about changing community attitudes actually turn the problem around and we start seeing a reduction in the overall amount of violence. And of course, The challenge with that is that that's not going to happen in an election cycle. It's going to be a 2 to 3 generation project to see those community attitudes changed. So particularly around this area of stopping violence before it occurs, it's almost imperative that we have bipartisan support for action in that area that recognises what it will do to the budget in the short term, but then in the long term what those benefits will be in the human sense, but also in the economic sense to government, because we know that the issue of violence against women currently costs the Australian community $14.7 billion a year.
And do we have any sense of the scale of public investment that would make that kind of difference that you're talking about?
Simplistically, I don't think it's not purely about investment. I think government has a right to expect innovation when it invests. I don't think any of us want to just keep doing the same stuff we've always been doing. But by example, in terms of a comparison, you've got $14.7 billion as the cost. At the moment, we invest $500 million. Now, my maths isn't very good, but that's a pretty big disparity.
We get the picture, don't we?
You could probably double or triple that and think about how you use it and how you link the messages right from the community attitudes changing stage right through to the recovering from violence stage, the messages and the approaches, and see real results for that money.
So why don't you help us now understand what are the community attitudes that are probably commonly held in your view that are unhelpful?
I might hand that to Paul if I can, because it's a prevention.
So there's a strong body of international evidence that positions 2 key drivers of men's violence against women. And the first is gender inequality, and the second is cultural circumstances where traditional rigid gender stereotypes are held to. In everyday discussion, it's often hard to make the connection for people between gender inequality and violence against women. But it's very clear internationally that societies where there are lower levels of gender inequality, there are lower levels of violence against women. In many respects in public policy, Australia would be satisfied if it can benchmark itself against North America or Great Britain or other European countries. UN Women did some research in 2011 that was able to show that lifetime incidence rates of intimate partner violence in Australia are at about 27% of women. And that compares with Germany, North America, Great Britain. However, if we look at Switzerland, we see a society where the incident rate is a half to a third of that, 10% of women. So we know that different cultural and political and historical circumstance can produce significantly different rates of violence against women. And so a key driver to affect prevention and affect community and attitudinal change is to work at issues of gender equality and to peel back and address gender inequality. And in Australia, compared to some circumstances, we are well positioned in that regard, but in other comparators, we are horribly positioned. The percentage of women on the boards of leading Australian companies is very low. The percentage of women leading as CEOs in top-tier organisations, again, is minuscule. And so we have powerful messages being delivered every day into society, into community, that in some way men are better positioned to lead, are more capable, are more powerful, and we reinforce a sense of inequality and male privilege and male entitlement. And from that soup of distorted values and experience and inadequate role models comes a sustained position over thousands of years and extended socialisation that women are less, and therefore violence is first of all minimised, often condoned, and in many ways in everyday interactions trivialised.
Joanna, you might have you might think many people would probably, in their own thinking or their own observation, think that violence is a consequence of other antecedents, that someone was intoxicated, they were using drugs, they were other reasons. But you wouldn't hold to that view that it's the end of a chain. You'd see these attitudes as being the controlling issue in the matter?
Yes, and what we know about violence in a family context is that it's very much about control. And so choices are being made to exercise violence in order to maintain control. And in fact, one of the stats on violence that Paul didn't give is that 1 in 4 women have experienced emotional abuse in an intimate partnership. And very often it's not even necessary for the perpetrator to use physical violence because the level of emotional control, which could be so often begins with social isolation, could be so strong. That being said, I don't think we can't ignore the fact that the presence of alcohol and drugs, mental health issues and so on does increase the likelihood of violence. Now, that means it doesn't change the view that violence is a choice, but it does mean that when we intervene with those men to try to create change, we have to address those issues that they're facing as well as the violence.
Because, as you described it, Paul said this is a thousands of year-old cultural patterns that we all are part of, and the imprecision of these sort of things. What are the kind of intervention factors that we actually, given it's such a big and organic issue, that we can be confident make a difference?
I'll lead with Paul the very early intervention stuff. Yep. about really trying to stop violence before it even occurs and how you change community attitudes. I guess later on in what happens, which is where I work, unfortunately, one of the things that I feel very strongly about is that the way the system works at the moment really requires a victim, survivor of family violence to keep herself safe. She must seek intervention orders. Police do that a lot more on women's behalf, but it still has to be reported. She then has to prosecute. She has to make sure that any breaches are prosecuted. She has to give evidence. We still have a system that's very much based on women fleeing their family home, often with several children, and having to relocate their children. A lot of us in the sector, I think, believe it's time that if you like, the viewpoint shifts towards the perpetrator and how the system can intervene with the perpetrator. And that is, I guess, both very early on in the piece. There are some tactics that are used by some police forces in Britain, which are sort of loosely called hassle tactics, and essentially what they do is they constantly show up at the perpetrator's door, checking in on him, and also they actually charge him with things that they can charge him with, legitimate things that they can charge him with. And that lets him know that he's being watched, and that it's the system that's holding him to account as opposed to the victim. Because that's the other aspect of our system, particularly the civil aspect, is that the perpetrator can take the view that, she's doing this to me, particularly when it's not a police application. We also know that there have been some very good outcomes from what we call men's behaviour change programs. The way we do those in Australia is a bit different from the US and the UK, but there are definitely some positive results, both in the sense of intervening with men who have a genuine desire to change. We've seen that it is actually possible to turn around that violent behaviour. But another interesting aspect of them is that they're quite effective with high-risk offenders because they're actually being monitored in a way through the program. So those are just two, but there are opportunities through corrections and the courts as well, because our men's behaviour change programs are not nearly as court monitored as overseas ones, and some of the evidence from the States suggests that it's as much the sort of stick approach as the carrot approach that works, because they get called back and back and back to the judge to explain how they're going on the program, and the partner's spoken to make sure there haven't been more incidents.
Because I think most people will be aware of some high-profile failures of, in a way, the regulatory or the order sort of system, and some proposals about how that might be made more coherent nationally now. That would seem to offer at least something on that monitoring and regulation side.
Yes, certainly the National Domestic Violence Orders Scheme and the information sharing proposal are really welcome. I guess it's also, though, important to emphasise that it's not a huge leap from what we've got. The information sharing is, but the National DV Orders Scheme, it's already possible to register an intervention order that's made in Victoria in any other state. So this really just removes that administrative stage. And I suppose one of my reservations when it was re-announced by the Prime Minister recently was that the emphasis was very much on, oh, this is good because then when women run away to another state, they're protected. Well, really we don't want that to be the case. And a lot of focus of state government policy has been on how do we keep women safe at home.
Because I guess there's as a public that gets used to an issue being raised, some discussion, and then proposals that come and, at least in the public's mind, give them some closure. From what you're saying about the duration of what we're talking about, the organic and complex nature of it, that'd be quite unhelpful to look like there can be simple answers given to something which maybe needs a much more organic and interactive response across the board and with a long duration.
Yes, it can be very distracting, and I think that in both the context of the National Partnerships Agreement Against Homelessness, under which refuges and family violence organisations are funded, and the National Partnership for Legal Assistance Services, under which my organisation and others like ours are funded, we've been running on 1-year funding agreements for about 3 years now, and our sector was actually cut, and then the funding was restored, and so those things, short-term extensions of funding agreements, reversal of funding cuts are somehow almost put forward as a win, whereas in fact we're staying still, if not actually going backwards in terms of, we are going backwards in terms of investment at the moment.
And Paul, going forwards or backwards at a high rate?
Well, the good news is internationally Australia is looked at as a leader on this issue. The development in 2010 through COAG saw a national plan which all governments in the country signed up to reduce violence against women and their children, a 12-year plan to 2022. That's almost unprecedented internationally, and every jurisdiction has a responsibility under that plan to develop their own responses. And in many other sectors, that is something that we would work very hard to try and achieve over a period of time and wouldn't have got there. But Joanna's spoken very clearly about the frustrations within the context of that plan, that we take 1 step forward, 2 steps back and 1 forward again in the development of the sort of service systems and response that we need. I think what is also good news is that as we've witnessed political change at federal and jurisdictional level across the country, we've seen a strong bipartisan commitment to the national plan and to the cascading action plans. And we're seeing this issue become something that every institution, every public figure has to have a position on. But we do need to go much further. We do need considerable investment, and as I indicated before, not in just one area. It needs to be in a balanced way and over time, and by over time I mean over a generation, 20 and 25 years, in response services, in early intervention and in primary prevention. And we have to understand, Joanna's also mentioned the significant cost to the economy. I think we need to think possibly of the significant benefits, not just at a moral level and for individuals who are caught in this trauma and their extended family and kin, but I think there's going to be a greater discussion over time about the benefits that will flow on to areas such as child protection, if we can make significant inroads into the incidence of violence against women. The 61% of women report children being present when abuse takes place. 48% report children are witnessing or hearing the violence taking place. And a lot of our conversation this morning has been about violence and about the death of women, the murder of women. But sitting behind that is a much longer pattern of control where emotional abuse, as Joanna said, but a wider range of control where children are intimidated or threatened, extended family, manipulation of finances and social networks and social engagement. And so when we talk about numbers like 1 in 3 and 1 in 5, these are really, as large as those numbers are, they are only a tip of an iceberg of a larger pattern of control and denial of agency. And I think that speaks to the extent of the problem that we have to confront. If we think of the public investment over time in quit smoking campaigns, drink driving, Grim Reaper, then we start to think of the sort of financial dimensions that are necessary to affect attitudinal and behavioural change across Australian society. And our level of investment in primary prevention of violence against women is nowhere near that level at this time.
And what sort of lift do you think, Paul, is needed in public investment into things that move it to a threshold of hoping to make a difference?
It's hard to put a number on it. I couldn't, across the 3 areas, I can't put a number on it myself. I would say that for our organisation to run a community education, not a community awareness, but a sustained community education program using high-profile media over 12 months and supporting that with tools and kits and guides that can inform local community action and local organisations and networks to engage those communities. We would need a budget of about 7 million. And that would be for a 1-year activity. Now we're saying that we would need to sustain that work over a 15-year period to gain significant traction. So let's do the math and say that in prevention, just in that community education component, we would need a commitment to a $100 million investment over a 5 to 7 year forward period.
Just changing tack slightly, I guess as Christian people, I'm used to the language of repentance and amendment of life. I know that kind of regret and expressions of sorrow are highly abased in abusive situations, but what is the prospect of and how is behaviour change in men who are in abusing situations? What's the prospects of change for that behaviour, and how do we make that happen more effectively?
Well, we know, as I said a little bit earlier, that men's behaviour change programs can work very effectively with men who do actually have a desire to change. One of the challenges and one of the reasons I mentioned corrections in that space is that currently, if you're sent to prison, you won't get access to any kind of rehabilitation program unless you're in prison for longer than 6 months. So the people who are accessing those programs are the more hardened criminals. You don't get a breach of an intervention order will rarely, unless it's aggravated, will rarely get a longer sentence than 6 months. So, we're not actually intervening with the right people in those corrections programs. There would also be a lot of opportunities to do that through community-based orders. And I have a view on this, I guess, that's becoming more common in the women's sector, but is not perhaps universally accepted. But that is really that if we want to hold perpetrators accountable for their behaviour, and we think that accountability means taking responsibility for what you've done, and that is the best foundation for change. Prison, we know, doesn't achieve that. We know the recidivism rates, we know the attitudes to women that abound in men's prisons, we know the levels of violence that abound in men's prisons. So generally, men come out of prison more likely to be violent rather than less. And I think the real challenge for us is that at the moment, as a society, the only signal we have that family violence is serious is a big prison sentence. And so if someone doesn't get a big prison sentence, we feel like the justice system isn't taking this seriously, and that's a bad thing. So we need another signal that says family violence is the worst possible violence. This is violence by someone who's supposed to love you. We need that signal, and we need sophisticated ways of actually encouraging men to genuinely take responsibility and ideally commit to change.
And Paul, you're working a lot in this space. What are the factors that are going to lead to an increased success of behaviour change, especially of abusers?
Well, if I come at this from the angle of prevention and those broad-based attitudes that we spoke about before in society, then in a sense we're all perpetrators because we are transmitting from one generation to another this continuing position of inequality between men and women. And we do that through a million interactions every day between siblings, between parents and children, between partners. And I do it in my interaction. Only a few months ago, before a long weekend, we were debriefing at work and people were talking about what are you going to do over the weekend? And I said, well, I'm going to have a blokey weekend. I'm going to build a fence and I'm going to fix a path. And I just stopped halfway through because I'd realised what I'd done was associate activities I like with a specific gender, and saying that was that gender's domain. It was perfectly legitimate for me to enjoy building my fence and building my path, but it was something that could have been one of my female colleagues' passion as well. So my point is that to undo thousands of years of socialisation, each of us can contribute to that, and contribute by reflecting upon our aspirations for our children, how they differ for our boy child and our girl child, the role we take in our relationships, the things we don't confront in a gentle and respectful way in our interchanges with our friends and with our extended family. When I play hockey very badly, if the coach or the captain says to our most often male team, you're playing like a bunch of girls, I have a responsibility to take that person aside, perhaps not right at that moment, but later on, and say, have you really thought through what you're saying? In fact, I think that's one of the, when we know that we've really made a difference, it's when society or community holds playing like a girl as a compliment and an affirmation.
However, Paul, I just want to push back a little bit, because say if someone here who is a man who's an abuser, they could easily hear what you're saying and thinking, well, what can I do? I'm just part of a thousands of year culture that's kind of embedded me with these attitudes. I don't think you'd want to be saying that to them, though, would you? What are the kind of things that an abuser has to face up to, and what kind of interventions can make a difference to their behaviour? So
when I've spoken with those involved in the men's behaviour change programs, they will say there are limitations on the programs because they're time limited, and the evidence would suggest that deep attitudinal and then behavioural change takes place over an extended, a longer term period, and that there is a big drop off with, if you like, compliance within 12 months of programs ending. And they would also say that how they try within the program to, in some way, lift the men above their circumstance and enable them to look back at what they've been engaged in doing and see it in a different way. And sometimes they will use the eyes of the children of the participants. So they're not able to directly, or perhaps in the first conversations, make the connection between the man and their partner, but they can say, what's the future that you hope for your daughter and your son? And encourage that conversation, and then say, what do you think your son or daughter is seeing in your behaviour now? And is there a disconnect between those? Change can only be effected by working at multiple levels in a mutually reinforcing way. So I think we have to say there are changes we want to affect in society. There are changes each of us have to continually work at, again, myself included, in our own personal lives. And there are challenges that we can encourage and enable those in our circles of personal and professional influence to make. And we have to work at each of those levels.
Yeah, Joanne, any additional things you'd like to say in that area?
Not on that particular topic.
Just turn now perhaps to I guess the world we live in, which is a world of cyber information, digital world, seems to, one level, offer a more democratic and egalitarian response between people's relationships, but I figure that doesn't necessarily always work that way in terms of the opportunities it gives.
No, it doesn't. And as I said, the federal government's announcement that they're going to look at technology-based abuse is really welcome. We probably, in probably every second family violence or stalking matter we see now, there's some element of social media being used to perpetuate abuse. And I guess one thing, and this is sort of around, I guess, the community attitude stuff as well, is many of you will probably be aware of the levels of abuse that female journalists sometimes get subjected to on Twitter, particularly if they're writing things that are broadly speaking feminist. And that abuse, quite alarmingly, is normally framed around, I'm going to rape you, I'm going to kill you. So there are some pretty extreme things happening in the social media space, both in a family violence context and in a broader violence against women context.
Just before we turn to have some interaction with the audience here, I'm sure we've got some people with a lot of experience and things that they'd like to say. What are from both of you, the two highest priorities that in terms of public policy we might be able to interact with and seek to make a difference?
Oh, that's tough. Okay.
It is. Well, it is, because it's a tough question. I think we often feel a bit disempowered with something which you described as being so entrenched, almost so much part of who we are as people. But I think there is, if we achieve something, there's eagerness to see there is a difference. So I know I'm putting you on the spot, but are there some things that if you wanted to reach for it as your highest aspiration of something that could change the most quickly?
Well, the two big picture things, and you probably want something more specific,
no,
so I will come
happy,
to that.
Whatever you want to say.
The two big picture things are turning the response system on its head so that we're concentrating more on the system holding perpetrators accountable rather than victims having to manage and moderate their own safety. And the second one would be the recognition that we have to take action right the way from stopping violence before it occurs, early intervention, response, and in the response sense we need to think about not just the crisis but also how women recover from violence in terms of finances and property. And until we really say we have a comprehensive plan, and the national plan is a great plan. The problem is the investment hasn't flowed in a comprehensive way. It's this quite audible plan, but it's laudable plan, but the investment goes in 10 million for this and 5 million for this, and
so it's fragmented. Yeah,
and the current investment under the national plan is $100 million, and while government currently spends $688 million on its own lawyers. So there's a lack of prioritising of the issue. And
30 million of that, of 100 million on an awareness campaign?
I think that might be additional, that 30 million. I don't know, but there was a Council of Australian Governments meeting on Friday at which, quite encouragingly, they started talking about that campaign no longer as an awareness campaign, but as a campaign to prevent violence against women and children, and said that they would be, seeking advice and using research. So that was a bit more encouraging than the original announcement, which was an awareness-raising campaign.
Yes, Paul?
And my two, not instead of, but on top of Joanna's bids. One's the media, and the other is children and young people. So the first, with regard to the media, we know that the media reports facts and incidents. It is also powerful in shaping public opinion and community attitudes. We know that from research in the States that repeated reporting of violence against women incidents will over time shift public opinion more to support the circumstance of the perpetrator than of the victim survivor. So it's critical in media reporting that context and thematic reporting is a part of what takes place. We also know that a third of women don't know where to turn to if their personal experience means that they need support and they need support to take action. In Victoria, research has shown that less than 2% of media reporting provides advice to women about where to get support. So a third of women don't know where to turn to for support, and less than 2% of public reporting provides them with information. So a simple thing, not costing anything really, but to mention the link to 1-800-RESPECT in every television, radio and print bit of reporting would have a profound impact on enabling women to take action. Secondly, with regard to children and young people, we have internationally the one proven intervention area is respectful relationships education, so engaging young people in schools about relationships, changing sexist attitudes and reducing violence incidents. Traditionally those programs focus on secondary school, and my contention would be that that is good and important but too late. These discussions, young people are forming relationships from early childhood. The values that inform relationships are shaped in early childhood. They're played out and tested through primary school, and we need that engagement much earlier. And we need to establish national standards for those programs, and we need to be able to provide informed advice to principals as they engage facilitators, as they engage important providers like White Ribbon in their programs, that they are choosing a program and a facilitator and an organisation that is working to evidence and working to proven standards. And there's a survey that we do in Australia, National Community Attitude Survey. It's been done 3 times now, over 5 and 7 year spaces. It's a powerful instrument. It draws on the views of 17,000 Australians. And there was some reporting about that at the end of last year. Australia's attitudes in terms of gender equality and sexism have flatlined between the last 2 surveys. And most disturbingly, the attitudes of young people in some significant areas have gone backwards. And that takes me, I think, to a key area of engagement. So social media. Lieutenant General David Morrison's YouTube clip when he addressed the Army about abuse and violence has been seen internationally 1.5 million times. So social media, the web, is a powerful communication tool for good, but we know that the sort of contemporary games that young people play that use that environment, so gaming, most often uses women as wallpaper, portrays women as a victim, pleading for mercy, the subject of players of men's violence. And the adult world and the informed campaigns are nowhere near yet competent enough in that space to balance that influence. So that and access to pornography are areas that we have to invest in, and it's a challenge for me and my organisation, given that we now host The Line, a national social media platform engaging young people 12 to 20 years of age, to become far more risk-taking and competent in that space, and to challenge the industries that sit behind that space to develop their own standards of engagement.
Well, thanks. I think we're going to open up now some comments and questions from people who are here.
I am a writer and activist in the field of Christianity and domestic abuse. I co-lead the blog A Cry for Justice, and we are seeking to awaken the evangelical church to domestic violence and abuse in its midst. I really appreciate you having this conversation today, Philip. My question is, I'll have to preface it a little bit. Recently, there was a call put out by the Centre of Public Christianity in Australia for the churches in Australia to review and evaluate what their teaching and practice is that may be contributing to mitigating or enabling or condoning domestic abuse. Now, I was very pleased to hear of that call, but it seems like the conversation has kind of fizzled away, although discussion may be happening in the back rooms. My question is, I would like to see the Anglican Diocese of Melbourne take up that call and push it, not just in this diocese, but across all the churches of Australia. Will you do this? And my call is not just for the Anglicans in Melbourne here, but any other Christians of any other denomination. Please, will you keep that alive and make it not just a local thing, but across Australia for all the churches?
I'm asking your comments, please, on the interrelationship between the shambles of our mental health system and domestic violence, because my experience is you can have all the orders in the world, but if someone's seriously mentally ill and they're left untreated, no intervention order is going to be effective.
Just on the first one, I think that the evidence is that we need across all institutions really, and across any organisation which is influencing human relationships. And I know that these issues are very powerfully picked up in our Anglican schools, and schools are, I think, saying that the importance of how relationships are managed. It's just interesting just coming in here today. I don't know, I walked past, I don't know whether it was a kung fu class or an exercise class, but even things like we've popularised things like boxing and martial arts. We sort of normalise those as things which are received without probably the kind of the violent overtones or origins they might have. And I think you can imagine that in most of our societal organisations, churches amongst them, there are many things that need examining. So Barbara, yes, I think we need to examine things thoroughly as widely as we can.
In relation to the second question, I think that there is a very big challenge around the intersection between mental health and family violence. One of the things that we advocate for is the expansion of what the acronym is KISP, Court Integrated Services Program, and that's a program that's generally used in the criminal jurisdiction of the Magistrates Court, and it's a therapeutic justice sort of process that enables a perpetrator to get support for the other issue than their criminality, and that can be used, I think, as part of a community-based order or as part of a pre-sentencing process. It's not currently available in the intervention order space, and part of that reason is the very challenge that you've identified, which is that the system, partly because of this massive reporting to police, the system is just overloaded, and so it's hard to actually have a therapeutic approach to a perpetrator of violence who has a mental health issue when one magistrate is hearing 80 matters in a day. But I think that is a very big part of the solution, is making the Court Integrated Services Program available in the intervention order jurisdiction.
Anything to add to that, Paul?
I think that same NCAS survey that I spoke about before indicated that 1 in 5 men and women in Australia believe that men should be the head of the household, and 1 in 4 believe that men make better leaders. So if we are to make the sort of profound changes in the platform of society, those attitudes that sit behind, that perpetuate sexism, that then allow violence to flourish, then we have to work with all institutions and community organisations to be able to have private and intimate conversations in places where people feel safe, to have broader level community engagement and public conversations. Those institutions are our political institutions, they're our religious and faith institutions, they're our sporting competitions and codes, And our workplaces. So the places where we as people work, live and play are the places where we need to engage and have those conversations if we are to affect change.
We've been talking a lot about vaccination throughout the community, and I wonder whether Paul wouldn't regard educators a vital place so that they could primarily vaccinate, give a booster dose in primary and a tertiary dose in secondary education and perhaps even in tertiary. That seems an influential sector as well as the journalist. I wonder if you feel that's a worthwhile thing to do.
My name is Dr. Rebaudet. I'm the Violence Prevention Project Officer for the diocese. It was a question that I had for Joanna. How do you see the idea of women and children remaining in their own home and the perpetrator leaving?
Just following up on the education idea, I have had conversations with, Deborah Colliver, I'm from the ACT, with a teacher who felt that unless those respectful relationship education programs are embedded in the curriculum and delivered by the teachers, that they're actually not going to be effectively managed and rolled out. Because they're often brought by outside people coming in, and the teachers themselves are the ones who are delivering most of the education over the year. They're the ones who need the information and education about respectful relationships. So I wonder about your comment about that.
So perhaps if I could comment on the education aspects. Immunisation, vaccination, what a great analogy. A publicly funded program, evidence-based, whole of population, still some significant resistance in pockets of the community to it. It does speak to exactly the issue we're discussing today. Yes, I think I've said quite strongly, schools, primary, secondary and early childhood are key places for engagement. From a variety of bits of research and professional engagement myself, I know that the two areas of engagement of children that feel the least competent and equipped to the task are parents and teachers. And when I say the task, I'm talking about the tasks of values formation, the discussion of sexuality and relationships. Programs that come in, engage a group and leave don't meet best practice. Best practice in a workplace, and you can see a school as a workplace, or you can see it as a setting for learning and engagement of children and young people, has a whole of system, a whole of setting engagement. So the school leadership must be committed to the program. The school as a community of professionals must have their own policies and procedures in place that respect gender equality, that deal with violence and sexism. And the program that's provided and led by teachers and that teachers are trained in is supported by that organisational frame and context. We do have in the national curriculum, in the health and PE stream, an important hook into respectful relationships education. And if we maintain that as a nation going forward, we have a great opportunity to build on the good initiatives that are there. But our respectful relationships programs are a patchwork across the country. And as I said before, there aren't national standards, and a key standard must be a whole of school engagement and commitment.
In terms of women being able to remain safely in their own homes, we've had some investment in this state in that, but it's sort of tended to focus on brokerage money around being able to change locks and that sort of thing. So it's not really, it hasn't been a comprehensive approach to how women can remain safely in their homes. Unfortunately, there will probably always be a cohort of men who are just too dangerous for their partners not to go to a secure location. But there are a huge number of men who are law-abiding in other aspects of their life. Unfortunately, that's quite common, who are highly likely to comply with an intervention order, and she should be able to stay safely in the home. Now, that's good for her and her kids, from a social and emotional perspective. It's good for the government from an economic perspective in terms of the costs of dislocation and so on. So certainly one of the things my organisation, together with a group of other organisations working in this area in Victoria, we've been lobbying for national standards around safe at home programs. And yes, I think in the same way as I'm saying we should be turning the lens onto perpetrators, this is sort of the other side of that, is that by doing that, that is more likely to enable women to remain safely in their own home.
Just on the education question, I've just been at 3 Anglican schools in the last 2 days, so I've got a little bit of recent exposure to the energy of young people, especially in school education. And I'm aware issues that they, as almost like develop a peer group value around, especially about environmental issues, climate change, the things that young people tend to have a high degree of passion. They organise themselves, they, I think, establish a value amongst their peer group and have great peer leadership in that. I think there's great opportunity, especially if we can find some of the community narratives that young people can engage in. And I suspect some of this whole journey of what information is put out, what kind of narratives as a community we construct, because it otherwise is very easy to see, in a sense, not the embeddedness and the cultural character of what we're talking about, but in a way still the exceptionalism of something. And I think if anything we're hearing today is that this isn't about exceptional and occasional aberrant behaviour of a perpetrator, but it actually is about how people use social media, how children in school, when they get first access to their smartphone, what kind of chat groups they get on, what they say about their friends, the cyberbullying. I mean, there seems to be that there's so many layers of things, and I think that I have a lot of optimism that young people in schools have a high appetite for that kind of peer group leadership once we form the narratives that they can actually imaginatively engage in. So I have a lot of optimism. I think there's a lot in it, and I'm certainly aware of in-service education events that I've been involved with teachers, where there's a high awareness and a high engagement of how they exercise their leadership in that school space as well.
I'm really also optimistic about the future and the commitment by young people to make the world a better place. So I share your optimism. However, I think that young people are caught up in a real paradox of culture. And I guess what I was thinking about was yesterday in the Herald Sun, they did an article, I think, on the use of social media and hookup lines, or hookup sites like Tinder. It's been around for 2 years, and worldwide there's 20 million users in that age group. So it's one of the largest dating sites or the main way that young people now get together. So on the one hand, we've got a discourse around wanting to work with young people to have more respectful relationships, and on the other hand, we've got a proliferation of that sort of very, well, I could put a value on it, but certainly a very shallow way of connecting with people. Paul, I'm interested in hearing a bit more about the line and what your organisation might do in that social media space, working with young people to bring about some of that social change rather than have old people like us going into schools and delivering programs.
We've heard a bit today about male privilege and entitlement, and I guess one of the issues about privilege is when you've got privilege you don't tend to know you have it, and certainly in my work trying to actually get men to understand that is quite fascinating. So my question is, what can male leaders be doing to start to challenge other male leaders to recognise the privilege they have and the impact that has on gender equality and therefore on men's violence against women?
So I think that's me to start off. If I start with the line, it was a federal government initiative about 6 years ago, and it's being reworked as we speak and relaunched in about a week's time. So the Line is a website that people, young people can go to for information. There are also sections within it for teachers and parents. And there are confidential chat and engagement rooms and facilities where moderators can take young people through exploring a range of issues. And we hope to be able to build on that over time, and certainly in the first 18 months as an organisation, our biggest reach has been through social media, through our own website and through the messages that we've used through Twitter and the like. And I've been staggered by the reach. A small video that we developed to communicate our message and rationale when we changed our name to Our Watch in September last year, we thought might have 5,000 views, and it was used to inform the launch, and it was valuable in that regard. It's being used as a training resource. It's had 135,000 views, I think, so far, and so there's enormous reach and potential through those medium. Scott, to your question, so I've spent too much of my working life as a CEO, white Anglo-Celtic male, so I'm probably the archetype of what you're talking about. Most of the time I've led organisations where the vast majority of other leaders and workers have been women. And so in a space where I've tried to work for the common good and for social justice, I've had more privilege than most. I guess within my workplace and relationships, I've tried to foster partnership arrangements, relationships, shared leadership models. Certainly in the leadership of Our Watch, the chair of our board, Natasha Stott-Despoja, and I describe the leadership task as shared between the two of us, and in that we're trying to model something different. And I think in important initiatives such as Liz Broderick's Male Champions of Change, you have male leaders in public sector and corporate Australia taking a public position on their role and their conduct and challenging their peers in industry and public sector to think and frame and position differently. And I'm very pleased to be able to say that one of our directors, board members, Alan Cransberg, the head of Alcoa, also chair of the West Coast Eagles, is a member of a similar group in Western Australia promoting change in corporate Western Australia.
Thank you.
I wanted to just add one point, which isn't on the prevention point at all, but really just to say that I've had some quite strong messages over the last few weeks. I've been doing a lot of meetings with politicians around funding, which is incredibly boring but important. And the very strong message I've had is now is the time for getting some actual change on this issue, that we probably have a 12 to 18 month window. Someone in state government expressed it to me as, a few years ago we were all talking about mental health. Right now, with Rosie Batty as Australian of the Year and a lot of organisations and institutions taking up this issue, this is the time for actually creating the sort of change that we need. So if you feel like there is some action you can take, I would suggest at the very least writing to your local MP and to relevant ministers about the issue. And I guess the key point is, and we can find a nicer way of saying this, but the key point is we've had a lot of talk. Where's the investment? If you want to see some change in this issue, there actually needs to be prioritising of this in the budget this year and beyond.
Well, I don't know how far we have to reach back, but I know shortly I'm involved in a 200th memorialisation of the Battle of Waterloo. But you think of just that 200-year space, the way in which the world that we are part of has been washed over with violence. The European colonisation of Australia really, washed over with violence that we still, I think, don't in our popular retelling account for. So we are talking about something which, in one way you can easily feel is totally overwhelming, that we are in a world that is so immersed internally in the most intimate spaces we'd expect to be safe, and also in the public spaces where people deserve to be safe. So to me, that the fact of what we're dealing with is a very great one. I think we've heard described how so embedded it is in many ways. We've come to just normally accept things. And so I think the journey will involve also a very organic and a networked response. And for the things that have been encouraging and optimistic, I'm very grateful, because otherwise I think it would be a pretty bleak scene about human nature and our essential tendencies towards destructiveness, which were they all that was to it, would be too awful to imagine. So can I just close in a prayer, acknowledging those realities and acknowledging that we are called into a different ideal of relationship because of God's love for us each. Loving God, we thank you that we've been able to explore a little the painful matters that affect people so personally, so many people, and throughout different generations, the ripples of effect of violence are awful, and ones that we would earnestly seek that your wisdom to apply to these situations to make a different future. We thank you for the words that we've heard today. We know that there may be things stirred within us which are also very deep, and we pray for your mercies and your truth to be in our hearts as we reflect on our own attitudes and our own values. And so we commit these things and all that are the thoughts that have arisen in our minds to your love and to your mercy. And we pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. So would you like to appreciate both Joanna and Paul for their contribution?